Larry who? Never heard of her.
What sort of a man is he?
Chick from Bama.
A man like any other, but more so.
Well, I thought he was dead.
This is the Larry Alex Taunton Show. Let's light this candle.
Welcome in on this very busy day in the news. Of course, what is dominating the news is the Russo-Ukrainian war. But before we get to that, let me just say a few words about this podcast. Again, if you're just joining us, we are still in the experimental phase with what this podcast is going to look like. Eventually, we'll have a proper background. Right now, you're just sitting in my house, and we don't have any of that as yet set up. And we're kind of practicing with the medium. But we thought that the content, if we think it's good, we would share it with you as we're still working on and shaping what this whole thing is going to look like. You know, that intro right there, I couldn't help but smile as I was listening to it. You have a couple of voices that you might recognize. The one guy who says there, Hick from Bama, that is the voice of Christopher Hitchens from our 2010 debate, where I had begun the debate by suggesting, hey, I'm just a guy from Alabama. I'm not a guy with this impressive English accent and the Oxford pedigree. And Hitchens gets up and he says, "Don't buy it." The whole Hick from Bama narrative. So anyway, that was one of the voices you heard there. The other one, I thought he was dead, was Coach Gene Stallings. For those of you who perhaps don't live in the United States and who are listening to the show, or maybe just don't follow football, Coach Gene Stallings is a legendary football coach in the state of Alabama, the state of Texas. He won a national title at the University of Alabama. He's kind of a John Wayne figure, and Christopher and I, my son Christopher and I, we went out there and spent a day with him on his ranch, and we asked him to record a couple of little sound bites that we could use. And he had more fun with that. He was ad-libbing, saying all kinds of things that were just so funny, and we couldn't resist using it as part of the intro to this show. And in fact, I just did a podcast with a group called the Bama Standard. The Bama Standard is they're an Alabama football podcast, and they had seen that I'd spent the day with Coach Stallings and asked me if I would come on and share some of his football stories, which I did, and it was a lot of fun. It was also fun just simply to be talking about something other than the heavy stuff that we have in the news. One might even say the crazy stuff that we have in the news, and that is my segue into one of the first things that I want to talk about here. The war in Ukraine. I'm asked about this an awful lot because, of course, I wrote a book called The Grace Effect. Some of you will be familiar with it. Some of you will have read it. And that book is very hard to categorize. Unfortunately, my publisher, labeled it, HarperCollins, they labeled it an adoption book. But the book is a lot more than that. It's a warning about socialism. About what socialism brings to a society, what it does to a society. And I was using our adopted daughter Sasha as a vehicle to tell that story, rather than just simply using data and just facts and figures. I wanted people to understand the real life, flesh and blood consequences of a socialist worldview, what it does. And it is, by the way, a worldview. It isn't simply an economic system. It is as I say in the book, it is atheism masquerading as political philosophy, and it trickles down into every aspect of society. But I've been in Ukraine many times. My family's been in Ukraine. I've been in Russia many times, and I have a master's degree, PhD work in Russian history and European history, and so as a result, people ask me an awful lot, about this particular issue, and I like to be fairly slow in responding to some of this stuff because at Fixed Point, we aren't really news of the moment driven. Latest, breaking news. Shooting in Homewood. That's not what we do. We are addressing mostly ideas that shape the culture. And an article that we might put out today may very well be relevant in a year, in 2 years, and 5 years, from now, rather than one that's simply about something that's happening in the moment. So I haven't rushed to get my perspective on Ukraine out there because I've kind of wanted to pay attention to see how it all was playing out before I made any real commentary. But one of the things that has really struck me in the news has been the Putin is crazy, narrative. I don't know if you've picked up on this, but following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I wondered how long it would take before pundits started saying what they say about all of America's enemies, and that is that they're simply crazy. And it didn't take long at all before we started hearing this. The White House press secretary, she said that Putin might be suffering from some kind of COVID isolation. He needs to get out more. If he did, perhaps he'd be a better adjusted human being. And where most of us, most people, perhaps when they're not feeling themselves, in the pop culture, somebody, smokes a cigarette, or they take a nap, or they go on vacation, or maybe they sit down with a glass of wine and classical music. Putin, he invades another country, at least that according to the White House press secretary. The Daily Beast said that Putin is clinically insane. How they would know he's quote unquote clinically insane, I don't know. Have they examined him? But anyway, that's the narrative that they put out. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican, he bought into to this as well, and he said that something is off. That's exactly the way he put it. Something is off with Putin. The way he talked, he made it sound like him and Putin, they're bunkmates. He knows him really, really well. They're roomies. They go way back together. And my good friend Putin, something's off. South Carolina Senator, also a Republican, Lindsey Graham, who sounded a bit unhinged himself, he implicitly accepted, this diagnosis of Putin, and he moved from the something is off stage of things to someone needs to bump Putin off. He went on Twitter, Lindsey Graham, and said, "Would somebody please assassinate Vladimir Putin?" Then the Washington Post ran a speculative piece on the Russian dictator's mental stability. So this narrative was all over the place. And in case you have any doubts about it, media narratives are scripted to some extent. I don't know how many of you are paying attention, but the January 6th happens. And January 7th, did you notice that everyone was using the word insurrection? They were all using that word. They weren't saying a disruption at the Capitol. There were riots at the Capitol. There was a demonstration at the Capitol. They all used a single word, insurrection. Almost makes you think there were talking points, that were sent out to all the media outlets. And of course, there were. And so it is with Putin. Now, what I find interesting about this and also troubling is that Western analysts have almost always been wrong, spectacularly wrong, when it comes to understanding the Russian mind, motivations, their political intentions. We've almost always been wrong on this. And I remember when I was, when I was very young, many of you will remember this too. First came the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. That event is scarcely remembered today for some reason, probably because it came about largely as a result of the policies of Ronald Reagan, and no one wants to give him any credit for that. But the fall of the Berlin Wall is maybe the singular most important event of the historic event of my lifetime. And when that happened, a kind of euphoria swept across the Western world. You had, Eddie Money, singing that song, "You and I know what love is worth. We're going to build a heaven on earth." He talks about turning water into wine, and he talks about, the name of the song is called "Peace in Our Time." Peace in our time, echoing back to a phrase used disastrously by Neville Chamberlain, but first used by Benjamin Disraeli after the Congress of Berlin in, the 1870s, I think. And you also had at that time the Scorpions, singing a song called "Wind of Change." All this, in other words, the narrative of peace sweeping the Western world seeped down from academia all the way down into the pop culture, rather than the domino effect, the domino theory, the old theory that suggested that one nation after another was going to fall to communism. Some of you will remember, those old black and white, documentaries that we were shown in school that would show communism bleeding into other countries. Well, this was the reverse of the domino theory. We were being told then that, no, what we're seeing, rather than one country after another falling like dominoes to communism, they're standing up to one by one to freedom and to capitalism. So that was the narrative at the time. But they were, as I said, spectacularly wrong. What we began to see by the mid-90s was a trend back in the other direction after a brief window of opportunity opened to the West, and it seemed to be this trending towards freedom, is many in the East Bloc decided that freedom was a little overrated and it wasn't cracked up to be all that they had been sold. And it's important for us to understand that freedom, as we understand it in the Western world, is alien to the histories of Ukraine and Russia. And I know some of you are thinking, well, isn't Ukraine a democracy? Yes, the Ukrainians would certainly say that they are, but not a democracy in a way that we in the West would understand it. They are a deeply, deeply corrupt political culture, just like Russia. Both of them. And of course, their histories are intertwined. But now that things are no longer moving, towards the freedom and prosperity that was predicted by just about every think tank and policy analyst way back in the 90s, and how democracy was triumphing. Now that none of them seem to have anticipated Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the narrative is, well, that just is an indicator that Putin is crazy, that he's crazy. Now, I want to point out to you, just at a basic level of Russian history, one of the first things that you learn in Russian history, even if all you have is a superficial understanding of Russian and Ukrainian history, is that Russia has always viewed Ukraine as essential to Russia's security and survival. Now, I keep hearing and seeing on social media, the narrative of people saying, well, listen, if it's all about buffer states, which Ukraine is a buffer state, then why didn't Putin invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries that also joined NATO? Well, because those countries are to Russia. It's not to say, by the way, that he won't eventually invade them. But those countries are to Ukraine, say what Cuba or Jamaica are to the United States. Ukraine is Canada. Words and phrases like breadbasket and warm water port appear throughout any readings of Russian and Ukrainian history. Russia has always regarded Ukraine as vital to its survival. And yet, all the money at the Cato and Brookings Institutes, at the State Department and in the Biden White Houses did not see any of this coming. That to me is startling. I mean, all one has to do is look at Russian history. Peter the Great did this. Catherine the Great did this. Various czars did this. Stalin did this. And successive Soviet leaders, who followed him. This has always been the policy towards Ukraine. And Putin warned us. He warned us about Ukraine. And yet the Obama, actually it started further back than that, the George W. Bush, the Obama, and the Biden White Houses, not Trump, interestingly enough, they decided that meddling in Ukraine made sense. They decided that using Ukraine to provoke the Russian bear was wise. And it made no sense at all. None. And 30 years ago, we convinced the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear arsenal. And in exchange for our guarantees of defense, we've seen how that's worked out for them. We're a world away, and the Ukrainians share a border with Russia. So this is highly problematic and complicated. But again, I come back to this idea of Putin as crazy. Is Putin crazy? I've never met the man. I've never read any reports of examinations of his mental health. But I'm inclined to say that the man is not crazy. And that is because I believe that the Putin is crazy narrative is intellectually lazy. It is the narrative that you hear about all of America's enemies. Before Putin, we heard this about Osama bin Laden. We heard this about Saddam Hussein. We heard this about the Ayatollah in Iran. And it's very important. It's certainly we as Christians, I as a Christian, believe very strongly that we're spiritual beings and that it is possible to commit heinous acts and to be perfectly rational. Let me repeat that. It is possible to commit heinous acts and to be perfectly rational. This is Hannah Arendt's thesis. If you're familiar with the book, her 1961-62 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. If you've not read that book, it's a little book and it's an interesting book. It's really a collection of her articles written for the New Yorker, I believe, when she was sent over in 1961 to cover the trial in Jerusalem of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And all the judges, she says, declared, Eichmann insane. And she said, in denying the reality, because the reality was too disturbing. She said multiple psychiatrists, psychologists examined Eichmann and came to the conclusion that he was not crazy. Furthermore, he had not been warped by Nazi ideology as a youth. He joined the Nazi Party at 33. He'd never read Mein Kampf. Hannah Arendt ultimately concludes that Adolf Eichmann was simply an ambitious bureaucrat. He wasn't particularly anti-Semitic. He had never killed anyone personally in his whole life. He was just simply a guy looking to move up the Nazi ladder, and he did so by making the trains run on time to such places as Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Mittelbau-Dora, and Mauthausen. This is what he did. This is part of the final solution. Now, why is that disturbing? She says that all the judges wanted to deny this truth because the implications for humanity, for each of us personally, are far too disturbing, and they resonate in in the words of the prophet Jeremiah, who said in the 17th chapter of the book by his name, 17th chapter, 9th verse, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked above all things. who can know it? That is, which of us can fathom the depths of our own wickedness? Most of us want to pat ourselves on the back and say, you know, I'm a pretty good guy. I'm not as good as some, but I'm better than most. Biblically speaking, theologically speaking, you're not a good guy. None of us are. In fact, we're told in Romans chapter 3 that together they have turned aside, all of us. We have all turned aside from God's path. We've turned to wickedness. Now, some of you are listening to this and you weren't expecting, you know, to go from Russia to a theological discourse. But the two relate, because I come back to this idea that I keep seeing everywhere that Putin is nuts. Now, I've said that it's lazy, and it is, because that narrative avoids the hard work of trying to understand our enemies and looking for the connective tissue in their actions. I, for instance, when I was teaching at university or teaching in a preparatory school, if I'd asked students, you know, what were the Nazis' motives behind the final solution? What exactly were they doing? Well, if somebody had just written, well, they were crazy. Okay, all right. But then what? There was a kind of logic that they were working out, which has its roots in Darwinian thought. This idea that there is no God, there's no ultimate judgment in the next life for the things that you do in this one, that we're ultimately animals, we have no soul, and that there are higher species than others. These were all things that informed a logic, albeit a warped logic, that they were following, that they believed. So when we come back to this idea of Vladimir Putin as nuts, it's lazy because we're not really looking at what is motivating him. And yet, as I've indicated, just a simple look at Ukrainian history, at Russian history, would tell you that Russia has always regarded Ukraine as vital to their security. And for the United States to poke the bear and to for the Biden administration to be leading us, it feels, headlong into potential nuclear war. By calling Biden crazy, it's an excuse for poor policy. It's an excuse for your failed predictions. And it also is an excuse to not do the hard work of foreign relations, of negotiation, of diplomacy. It's dangerous because it allows you to skip the diplomacy phase and go straight to war. Well, we can't reason with him. There's no logic in anything he's doing, so we'll just send planes. We'll just send our troops. I don't know about you, but this isn't a war that I'm willing to see my own children die in. This isn't, and I say that, by the way, as someone who knows many people in Ukraine and for whom I pray and feel great concern. They're the real victims in the story. The Ukrainian people are the real victims in this story, but not their government. Not their government, which is they have a corrupt political culture, just like Russia. And another thing that I'm seeing in the news that has really got me fired up, I don't know how many of you are noticing this, but it's appearing on social media now. Ukraine has a very effective propaganda machine all over social media, and it's being assisted, of course, by Western media. And one of the ones that they're putting out right now is this idea that Putin, not Dolly Parton, no relation to Vladimir Putin, that Vladimir Putin is targeting Ukrainian orphanages. That is to say, with missile strikes and bombings, this kind of thing. Now, while I find that hard-fetched, not because Putin cares about Ukrainian orphanages or even his own orphans, because he certainly does not, but because it's of no strategic value. In fact, that sort of narrative does nothing but harm to his cause. So I don't buy the idea that Putin is targeting orphanages. But that narrative is all over social media right now that this is what Putin is doing. And so you see these videos, photographs, and stories of Ukrainian orphans, who are being assisted and saved by the Ukrainian people. Now, why do I find this outrageous? Well, as many of you will know, our adopted daughter, Sasha, who, by the way, is now happily married, our adopted daughter, Sasha, came from Ukraine. She's Ukrainian in terms of her origin. She's American now, but she's Ukrainian in terms of her origin. And Sasha, as we would discover, all the time that we spent in Ukrainian orphanages, you learn very quickly, and if you don't, Sasha would tell you, that they don't care. Ukrainians do not care for their orphans. They don't. And I'm speaking generally. There are the only exceptions we saw to this were a few women acting alone. They didn't act as part of ministries, as part of nonprofits, as part of government organizations. There are just a few women, Ukrainian women, that we would encounter from time to time who themselves had very few means. Often they were divorced or widowed, and they would, of their own time and money, go into the orphanages to try to mitigate the horror that was taking place in those orphanages. But the story that's being put out of Ukrainians, their deep love and concern for their orphans is outrageous, and it infuriates me. It infuriates me because they don't care. You spend any time in Ukrainian orphanages, and what you discover is that the kids are neglected, abused, given almost no education whatsoever. Sasha's teeth, when she had to have teeth pulled, they didn't even give her anesthetic. Imagine that. Imagine someone taking a drill to your teeth. It's like that old movie, Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman. This is the kind of thing that they did. The children were fed rotten food. We were told, when we would take Sasha from the orphanage, we'd have to return her. But Lori went and bought her some nice clothes, because the clothes she had, she wore every day. The same clothes every day. They were terrible clothes, ill-fitting clothes. They smelled. And so Lori went and bought her some new clothes. And our adoption facilitator said, don't let her wear those clothes back into the orphanage, because the directors will steal them and sell them or give them to their own children. Children weren't even given toilet paper. So don't tell me how the Ukrainians love their orphans, because they don't. The Ukrainian government could not give a rat's ass for their orphans. Forgive me for saying so, but I would like to use much, much stronger language in speaking of their treatment of their children. And that is also true of Russian orphanages. They share a common philosophy. The orphanages are running off of the accumulated fumes of a socialist, that is to say, a communist mindset and worldview, where there's no soul, and where we're strictly material beings. And in the Christian worldview, as I said earlier, we're spiritual beings and material beings. I'm reminded of something that Thomas Aquinas, said. He said that animals are all flesh, no spirit. Angels are all spirit, no flesh. But God made man a composite of both. He's spiritual and he's flesh, spirit and flesh. And he said, and as a result, we can ascend to the higher, that is, to the godly, or we can descend to the lower, that is, to the animal. And when you deny the existence of the spirit, you necessarily descend to the animal. And that's the way the orphanages are run. That's what they look like. What broke our hearts in adopting Sasha was all the children we left behind. I'll never forget their arms reaching through the bars, waving at Sasha. Das Vidanya, Sasha, as we were leaving. Those children are pushed out on the streets at age 16, where a majority of the girls end up in prostitution, roughly 30% of those with disabilities are dead by the age of what was it, 20, I think. Many of the boys end up involved in organized crime. Most of them end up with strung out on some kind of substance. I mean, this is what Ukraine is. This is what Ukraine looks like. They have no care for the least of these. And so while I feel a great sympathy for the Ukrainian people, for the Ukrainian government, I feel none. Here's another little indicator of just how corrupt the government is. I had to bribe every single Ukrainian government official but one in order to adopt Sasha. And the government gives to the children in the orphanage, each year, it's not much. It's like, $100 or something like that for each year of their life, so that when they quote unquote graduate from the orphanages or pushed out onto the street at age 16, they're given the money from their bank account, which is, let's say at this point, $1,600. It really isn't for the kids. So the government could say we don't do nothing for them. I mean, imagine that $1,600 is all you have, and you're pushed out onto the street. And of course, they don't have any idea how to use it. So these children, go spend a few nights in a hotel, or they go to McDonald's and they eat repeatedly. And then what do you know? Their money is gone. And that's how they end up in the lap of mafia types or of pimps. Well, when we were leaving, the orphanage directors informed us that Sasha had money in the bank. That's hers. But they said, we want it. We want that money. And there was a part of me that wanted to fight with them about that and say, no, it's Sasha's money. And I thought, Sasha, as yet, we are not out of the country. We'll let them have it. So we let them follow us to the bank. And we withdrew the money from the bank, and we turned around and gave it to the corrupt orphanage directors. For what purpose? They claimed that it was for the children, but I don't buy that for a second. And I just thought, Sasha, you're going to be fine, and we're going to get you out of the country. This isn't a battle we want to fight until the wheels touch down in Atlanta. And then I did by writing the book, The Grace Effect, in telling the story of these children. Coming back to the situation in Ukraine, I think that we need to be very careful as we're following not just the narratives on social media that we're seeing, bandied about, where it's so easy to manipulate footage, especially these days. A guy can do it, on his laptop, sitting at a coffee shop. But also the narratives that are coming out of, major news sources. I don't care if it's Fox News or CNN. You need to be very careful of what you're seeing from those news sources. In fact, it was CNN that was pushing this narrative about the Ukrainian orphanages in a very big way. And it could very well be, I will say this, in defense of CNN, it could very well be that the people at CNN simply don't know any better. Not everybody has been in Ukraine, and certainly those who have, very, very few of them have been in Ukrainian orphanages. So, if I'm a producer at CNN and somebody comes and tells me this horrible story of what is happening to these children, I probably want to get that story out there. The real story is how these children are being cynically used for propaganda purposes by the Ukrainian government. That's the real story. And it's not one that is currently being told, but we're going to do what we can in order to push back at this, in order to get that out of there. Ukraine the war in Ukraine is also something that we must be very careful in assuming too much. We tend to look at all of this through the lens of a Western worldview. How can we do any other? It's what we know. And so when we hear words like democracy, we make assumptions about Ukraine that aren't accurate or helpful. We hear stories like this about Ukrainian orphans. We look at that from a Western perspective, and it's the way we interpret these events. I will say to you that your Western way of thinking is not going to be helpful to you in interpreting what is going on in Ukraine. I said to you earlier on that the State Department, policy analysts, think tank types, White House advisors have very seldom rightly predicted what the Russians would do. And this is because we often make the assumption at bottom of U.S. foreign policy is often the erroneous assumption that we are dealing with people who want the same things that we do. That they want a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, a Nintendo for the kids. They want the salad shooter. They want peace and freedom. This is what they want. Well, that kind of thinking got us nowhere with Uncle Joe Stalin. It got us nowhere with Ho Chi Minh. It's getting us nowhere now with Xi, and it's getting us nowhere with Putin. You would think at some point someone would begin to say, maybe they don't want the same things that we want. And so again, when they act in a way that we think is inconsistent with what we believe is their best interests, we assume that they're crazy. This was a narrative that was put out about the 9/11 bombers. You'll remember this. And by the way, Muslim terrorist since then, this is what we hear. The guys who flew those planes into the sides of buildings, they're crazy. That is what's going on. And yet, I don't think they were crazy. Osama bin Laden understood very well what America was, and he hated it and wanted to destroy it anyway. The story we were told is all these people came from a poor, displaced backgrounds. Well, it turned out they weren't. They were educated. They had money. And furthermore, there was nothing to suggest they were crazy. Rather, the problem was we were trying to understand what they did using a secular key. When you look at what the 9/11 bombers did from a secular perspective, it makes absolutely no sense. And the crazy narrative seems to be the right one. Because from a secular point of view, where this life is all you get, and there's really nothing worth giving your life for, somebody flies their plane into the side of a building with a plane load of passengers and in an act of suicide, seems completely unhinged. However, when you use a different key, one that interprets their actions from the perspective of radical Islam, from the perspective of the Quran, the Hadith, the life of Muhammad, when you view it from the perspective of people who might be seeking eternal life, Allah's favor, and 70 versions in bliss, the tumblers all line up. And suddenly the 9/11 actions, the actions on that day, they are totally rational from that perspective. Well, so it is with Putin. When you're trying to understand Putin's actions from a purely Western secular perspective, it gets you nowhere. If, however, you look at Putin's actions historically, as I pointed out earlier, Peter the Great did this, Catherine II did this, Stalin did this, you begin to understand his actions make a great deal more sense. When you understand how vital Ukraine is to the Russians, how they have always viewed it as utterly essential to their existence, the actions make sense. Putin suddenly seems not crazy at all, but somebody who is acting in Russia's, not the world's, not NATO's, not the EU's, and certainly not America's best interest, but in Russia's best interest. And I'm not so sure he isn't acting in Russia's best interest. By that, do not interpret me as saying that I endorse what he's done. Putin's a killer. That's not my point. My point is that from a Machiavellian point of view, Are Putin's actions rational? Yes. Are they in the best interests of Russia? Probably, because it has been obvious that the West, the United States, the policies, particularly of the Obama and Biden administrations, has been to encircle Russia. We're going to gradually make buffer states we're going to gradually make NATO members of all of those buffer states. We did it with Estonia. We did it with Latvia. We did it with Lithuania. Ukraine is next. And Putin said, hold on right there. That isn't going to happen. And either you're going to back off and Ukraine is going to give me guarantees that they are not going to join NATO, or I'm sending the tanks in. And guess what? He didn't get those guarantees, and the tanks rolled. First by amputating Crimea from Ukraine and the Donbass region, and then Ukraine itself. So I believe, as we're reading the tea leaves here, I believe that this is silly U.S. foreign policy and the policies of the Ukrainian government themselves that have brought us to this point. And so I would strongly encourage you to be careful of the emotional appeals that we're seeing related to all this. And by the way, there's a terrific article by Lee Smith on Tablet, on tabletmag.com, tabletmag.com by Lee Smith. And the article is called Ukraine's Deadly Gamble. Again, that's tabletmag.com, Ukraine's Deadly Gamble by Lee Smith. This is a superb piece. Lee Smith, in my opinion, is dead on in his analysis of what's going on here. And it's his take, along with mine, that we are being manipulated by the Biden administration to go to war, at the very least to saber rattle, against the Russians, in large part to cover for the mistakes of the Obama and Biden administrations and to cover for their deep corruption in that country. Read Lee Smith's article, tabletmag.com, Ukraine's Deadly Gamble. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be back in just a minute. Just a little bit longer than we normally would with bumper music, because that's a song that I referenced earlier in the show. It's Eddie Money's song called Peace in Our Time. And it sort of reflects not only the period, which it most definitely does. The song, I think, was written in 88. And it really didn't achieve popularity until 89, 90. When Eddie Money, sang it. And the song came out, when you have Baltic states beginning in 1988 that are breaking away from the old Soviet Union. And, there was a great deal of optimism. And then when the collapse of the Berlin Wall came, and then in 89, November of 89, and then in the summer of 91, as I was boarding a plane to fly to London to continue my studies of history there, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so songs like this were extremely, popular. I also referenced the Scorpions, the headbanger rock band of Rock You Like a Hurricane fame, West German rock band. Had the song called Wind of Change. The wind of change blows straight into the face of time, like the storm wind that will ring the freedom bell for peace of mind. These are very hopeful songs. I don't condemn them in that they reflected a mood, a feeling of euphoria that was not wholly unjustified insofar as, listen, if your aunt and uncle, your parents, one of your children were caught on the other side of the barbed wire when the Berlin Wall went up, and that's the way it went up so suddenly that if you were just, in the Russian zone, to buy vodka, you were about all that you would go in the Russian zone for, see your family. It's too bad. You're stuck. You are not allowed to come back. And so 45 years that wall stood, it didn't stand up. The wall went up in 61. So the wall was up for 28 years, but for 45 years, people in East Germany were under Soviet oppression, under communism. And so when that wall came down, you can imagine the euphoria. Some of you are old enough to remember it. Others of you are not. But I let the song play because it doesn't just encapsulate that period of time. It also, and Eddie Money, by the way, did not write the song. He just sang it, which is so often the case. With singers, it's someone else's talent who writes it, and their talents that popularize it. Blue Suede Shoes was not Elvis. that was not him. But anyway, this song also encapsulates. It's a picture of the secular mind, the secular mindset. That line there at the end as Christopher was dialing it down. For you and I know what love is worth. Going to build a heaven on earth. Going to build a heaven on earth. Now, your worldview matters. And I said earlier in the show that I'm a Christian. Now, this isn't a Christian podcast. I don't think of it like that. This isn't a Christian show. Rather, it's a show, and I'm a Christian. So that worldview, you need to understand, bleeds into the way I see things. And I think it's the right worldview. That doesn't mean I'm right about everything that I say. It doesn't mean that everything I say is Christian. I wish that were true. I wish every action and word that proceeded from my mouth was Christian. That isn't the case. I'm not Nostradamus. Nostradamus, by the way, wasn't Nostradamus either. He just made so many predictions that eventually something had to be right. The Vikings will win the Super Bowl. The Jaguars will win the Super Bowl. The Packers will win the Super Bowl. The Cowboys win. Eventually you're going to be right. But the Christian worldview has a proper understanding of human nature in a way that a secular worldview simply does not. And let me illustrate this, because we've been talking about Russia and Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian orphanages, and motivations here. That line, for you and I know what love is worth, going to build a heaven on earth. A Christian knows we will never build a heaven on earth. And that's because a Christian worldview begins with a verse that I quoted earlier in the show, and that is Jeremiah 17:9, that the heart is deceitful above all things. How does it go? Pardon me. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperate and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Who can know the depths of our own depravity? Now, some of you perhaps have plumbed the depths of your own depravity. Others of you, perhaps holding your lapels, are quite sure that you are very righteous. Let me reassure you that from a biblical point of view, you are not. From a Christian point of view, we have all, to quote Romans 3, we have all turned aside. We have all turned aside. That is to say, we've turned aside from righteousness, from right. We are born, says Scripture, speaking lies. In other words, evil is innate to us. Romans 5:12 through 21 is where we get the doctrine of original sin. The term is never used in Scripture, but Augustine was the one to popularize the phrase. But the concept is there, that sin entered the world through one man. Now, what is interesting, and how in the world does that relate to this? Well, let me explain to you why it does, how it does. A secular worldview, you would think, at least with a superficial understanding of a Christian and a secular worldview, you would think the secular worldview is more compassionate, because a secular worldview does not maintain, at least the more popular versions of a secular worldview, do not maintain that the human beings are born wicked. It does not take that point of view. Rather, it speaks in terms of dispositions, genetics, of DNA, this kind of thing, and meaning that there are good people and there are bad people, and good people are good because of their cultural influence. Cultural influences nurture, in other words. And bad people are bad because something is broken in them. In other words, maybe they have a bad genetics, or because they had very bad influences. Now, as a Christian, no Christian would say that nurture does not matter. Of course it does. Having good parents, godly grandparents, godly influences is extremely important. Raise a child up in the direction he should go, and when he's old, he'll never depart from it. So the training of a child is extremely important. However, the Bible maintains that we are born with an evil bent. The secular worldview, as I've just explained, doesn't maintain that. Now, how does that play out in real space-time history? Well, let us consider, for example, George Bernard Shaw, only man, by the way, to ever win both a Nobel Prize for Literature and an Academy Award. I don't think he deserved either. He was a great writer, but he was an evil man. He was a communist to his black-hearted core. And he's most famous to those of you listening, probably for Pygmalion, otherwise known as My Fair Lady. And, I said that he was a communist. In 1931, Stalin invited him to Russia. And he went and saw the Soviet system. And, of course, he was shown everything that they wanted him to see. This is what a Potemkin village is, a very false impression. But he wasn't an idiot. I mean, he did know that Stalin was killing a lot of people. And so when he came back to the West and he said that Soviet society was what a society would look like if Jesus came down to earth. Now, he didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but this was kind of the secular version of Jesus, that we get from time to time. And so he maintained that, hey, this is what it would look like. I mean, it's heaven on earth. It's the Eddie Money song. We've created it. They've created it. They've done it. Well, a few sensible people asked him, yeah, but what about the state-induced famine in Ukraine, where they killed millions of people? What about collectivization? What about the purges? What about all those millions of people Stalin is dragging off into the gulag? Well, rather than denying it, George Bernard Shaw said, yeah, Stalin's killing people, but he's killing the right people. He's killing the right people. So you see, from a secular point of view, there are good people and there are bad people, and society is made better by exterminating the bad people. That was what Hitler did. Hitler believed that there were lower orders of our species. He believed that there were evil people and that all you needed to do, by nature, they were evil people, and they needed to be rounded up. Slavs, Jews, Christians were caught up in the dragnet as well, those who had adhered to God's word, because they opposed his regime and saw it for what it was, evil. And Hitler, of course, was an atheist, so he wanted them dead. And Hitler decided, we will create the utopian society. We will create the perfect society, heaven on earth, when we kill off all these people. Now, from a Christian point of view, we know that's wrong at multiple levels. The most obvious being, of course, you don't round up people and kill them. But there's another reason, because we know that human nature is itself broken. We have this interesting little story in our holy literature. It's the story of the flood. And God takes the most righteous man and his family, and he puts them on a boat, and he exterminates the rest of humanity, and they start all over again, and it doesn't take a minute before society is off the rails again. In other words, the biblical story, the biblical worldview would maintain that we could take the best, the most moral representatives of our species, and we could colonize the moon, and in a generation, things have gone wrong again. So we know better than this. So when we consider a story like this story, that's being put about, what's going on in Ukraine, we're dealing with two deeply corrupt political cultures. And we also are dealing with a man in Vladimir Putin who, as we've noted, we are capable as a species of doing evil things and being rational people. I don't buy the narrative that Vladimir Putin is crazy. I think he's acting in a perfectly rational manner, a manner that is consistent with Russian history, Russian leaders, and what he believes is in the best interest of his own country. So worldview matters. It makes a big difference in the way you and I see the world and in the way we interpret it. Ladies and gentlemen, we will end this podcast, this show, on that note, and we look forward to talking to you again next week.
Turn out the lights, the party's over. They say that all.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful for the standing ovation, but there will be no encore for today's performance. Please exit the building in an orderly fashion. Thank you.
Honey, can we leave now?